Hello, everyone. My name is Jill Fluck, and I'm an educational consultant with Blast Intermediate Unit 17. Thank you for joining this session on understanding instructional supports, accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction. This session is designed to help build clarity around the types of supports we use with students every day and how those supports impact learning and expectations. As paraeducators, you are constantly responding to students' needs in real time, often within just a few seconds, and always with the goal of helping students be successful. Today, we're going to take a closer look at those moments and think more intentionally about the types of support being provided, when they are appropriate, and how they impact access to learning. My goal today is to provide some clarity and practical guidance that you can immediately use in the classroom. By the end of our time together, I hope you leave with a clear understanding of three major instructional supports: accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction, or SDI. We'll also spend time looking at what these supports actually look like in the real classroom, because while the definitions may seem straightforward on paper, things can become much less clear in practice. Ultimately, this work is about helping students access learning while still maintaining appropriate instructional expectations. So let's get started with a quick reflection. Think about a time when a student was struggling academically, behaviorally, or emotionally during a task. What is the first thing you usually do? Take a few seconds to think about it. Pause the video, write down your response, and then resume the video when you are finished. You may have written something like helping the student feel successful, reducing frustration, clarifying directions, breaking the task into smaller steps, or helping the student get started. You may have also thought about shortening the work, reducing the task, or simplifying the assignment. Those are common responses too, especially when a student is overwhelmed or frustrated. Most of these responses come from a really good place. Our instinct is to help students feel successful. As we move through this session, we're going to think more deeply about how we help while still protecting students' access to learning and maintaining appropriate expectations. Before we start defining accommodations, modifications, and SDI, I first want us to step back and think about why understanding these supports matters in day-to-day practice. As paraeducators, the support you provide directly impacts how students experience instruction and access learning throughout the school day. Paraeducators support students across almost every part of the school day. This might include academic instruction, independent work time, group activities, transitions, behavior support, communication, and organization. Because of that, you are constantly responding to students' needs in real time. Sometimes those moments happen quickly. A student shuts down during writing, becomes frustrated during math, refuses to participate in a group activity, or struggles to get started independently. And in those moments, decisions often have to be made very quickly. You may find yourself thinking, should I step in right now? Should I explain this another way? Should I give a prompt? Should I help the student get started? Or is this a moment where the student needs additional wait time or encouragement? Those decisions matter because even small adjustments can influence how independently a student engages with a task, how much thinking the student is doing, and whether the original goal of the lesson remains intact. Sometimes support helps students successfully engage with challenging learning. Other times, without realizing it, adults may unintentionally lower the level of thinking or change what the student is being asked to do. That's why understanding the purpose and impact of different supports is so important. These are some of the most common questions paraeducators ask themselves throughout the day. When should I step in? How much help is too much? Is it okay to change the task? And honestly, these situations are not always clear cut. Many times, decisions have to be made quickly while also trying to support the student, keep the lesson moving, and prevent frustration from escalating. Most of the time, adults are simply trying to help, helping a student get started, keeping them engaged, reducing overwhelm, or helping them feel successful. But sometimes, without realizing it, the level of support can shift from helping a student participate in the task to removing too much of the thinking from the task itself. For example, giving answers too quickly, skipping difficult parts, simplifying assignments in the moment, or reducing the amount of work without direction. Those decisions often come from good intentions, but they can impact how independently a student engages with learning and what the student is ultimately being asked to do. Let's look at a simple scenario. A student is struggling with an assignment, so the task gets shortened. Take a moment and think about that situation. At first glance, it may seem like the student was successful because the student completed the work and the frustration was reduced. But pause for a second and consider this question. Did the student still practice the intended skill? That distinction is really important. Completion and learning are not always the same thing. Sometimes students appear successful because the task became easier or shorter, not necessarily because they were able to successfully engage with the original expectation. For example, if a student is expected to write a paragraph but is only asked to complete one sentence instead, the student may feel more successful in the moment, but the learning demand has changed. This is why understanding the purpose and impact of different types of support matters so much in classroom practice. This is one of the most important ideas from today's session. The type of support we provide impacts what students are actually being asked to do and learn. Sometimes support changes how a student participates in a task while keeping the original goal the same. Other times, the support changes the level of work or thinking the student being asked to complete. The distinction is incredibly important because even small instructional decisions can impact student independence and the rigor of the task. Before we move further into instructional decision making, let's briefly revisit accommodations, modifications, and SDI through the lens of classroom practice. When we support students, there are really three different things that might be happening. Sometimes we're changing how a student participates in or accesses a task. Sometimes we're changing what the student is being asked to complete. And sometimes the focus is on the instruction itself through specially designed instruction or SDI. Understanding which of those three things is happening helps us make more instructional decisions. Accommodations change how a student participates in or accesses a task, but they do not change the overall expectation. The student is still working toward the same goal as their peers. The support simply helps remove barriers that may make the task more difficult to access independently. Examples might include reading directions aloud, extended time, chunking information into smaller parts, visual supports, preferential seating, or organizational supports. The important thing to remember is that the level of work and thinking remain the same. The support changes access, not the expectation itself. Sometimes accommodations sound straightforward on paper, but they can look a little different in actual classroom practice. For example, chunking does not necessarily mean reducing the assignment itself. Instead, it might look like covering part of the worksheet so the student only focuses on one section at a time, giving just a few problems at once instead of the entire page, or checking in between sections to help the student stay organized and focused. The important part is that the student is still completing the same task and working toward the same goal as their peers. The support simply helps make the task feel more manageable and accessible. Let's do a quick check together. As I go through each example, take a moment to think about whether it is an accommodation or not. First, reading directions aloud. Yes, that is typically considered an accommodation because it changes how the student accesses the task, but not the overall expectation. Next, giving fewer directions. Is this an accommodation? No, that would more likely be considered a modification because it changes the amount of work or the expectation itself. And finally, providing a graphic organizer. Is this an accommodation? Yes, as long as the student is still working toward the same instructional goal, a graphic organizer would generally be considered an accommodation. Modifications are different because they change what a student is expected to learn or complete. In other words, the instructional expectation itself changes in some way. This might include reducing the number of questions, giving a different assignment, providing lower level reading material, shortening a writing assignment, or assigning work focused on a different skill level. For example, if the class is working on grade level comprehension questions, but a student is instead completing a much simpler passage with different questions, that would be considered a modification because the level of work has changed. Or if students are expected to write a 5 paragraph essay, but one student is only expected to write a single paragraph, the expectation for the task is no longer the same. Now, modifications are not inherently negative. Some students absolutely require modifications in order to participate meaningfully in instruction. The important thing is that these decisions are intentional, planned, and directed by the educational team, not made independently in the moment. This is where things can start to feel a little gray in practice. Some supports help students participate in the task while still keeping the original goal the same, while others actually change the level or amount of work students are being asked to do. For example, using a multiplication chart may still support the student in working toward the same math skill. On the other hand, reducing a 5 paragraph essay to a single paragraph changes the overall expectation for the assignment. These are the kinds of distinctions that can become difficult in real classroom situations, especially when adults are trying to help students feel successful in the moment. I want to pause here because sometimes people hear the word modification and they immediately think something inappropriate has happened. That's not necessarily true. For some students, modified work is completely appropriate and may be necessary for meaningful participation and progress. The key difference is whether the change is intentional and aligned to the student's individual needs, not simply done in the moment to reduce frustration, speed up completion, or make the task easier. This is why communication and collaboration with the instructional team are so important. Specially designed instruction, or SDI, refers to the instruction that is intentionally designed around an individual student's needs. SDI is documented within the student's IEP and is typically focused on helping the student build specific skills over time. You'll often notice that SDI is planned, intentional, ongoing, and systematic. This is different from simply helping a student finish an assignment or providing quick support during a task. Instead, SDI involves targeted teaching connected to an identified area of need. That might include explicit reading instruction, structured writing support, guided practice with feedback, or repeated instruction focused on a specific skill. SDI involves very explicit and structured teaching. You'll usually notice elements like modeling, guided practice, feedback, repetition, and intentional instruction over time. In other words, this is not just helping a student complete a task in the moment. It's focused teaching designed to help the student gradually build a skill, strategy, or an area of understanding. Sometimes SDI can feel a little abstract, so let's make it more concrete by looking at what it might actually sound or look like in practice. Across all of these examples, the common thread is that the student is receiving intentional instruction designed to build a specific skill over time. For academic support, that might include explicit phonics instruction, modeled writing, or direct teaching of strategies. For learning and processing, it could involve teaching students how to use graphic organizers, guided practice with feedback, or structured support for organizing thinking. And for language support, it may include vocabulary pre-teaching, sentence frames, or explicit language modeling. Notice that these are not just quick supports provided in the moment. These are instructional practices that are intentionally taught, practiced, and revisited over time in order to help students build independence and develop specific skills. A good rule of thumb is this: if a skill is being explicitly taught, practiced, and revisited over time, it is likely SDI. That's an important distinction because it helps separate specially designed instruction from quick accommodations or informal support provided in the moment. For example, helping a student organize materials one time may simply be support, but Intentionally teaching and repeatedly practicing organizational strategies over time would be much more characteristic of an SDI. The focus is on building a skill through planned instruction, not just helping a student complete a task in the moment. This chart is really the anchor for today's session. At the most basic level, accommodations change how a student accesses or participates in learning. Modifications change what the student is expected to complete or demonstrate. And SDI focuses on the instruction itself through intentional teaching designed around a specific area of need. These distinctions matter because they help guide the decisions adults make throughout the school day. If there's one thing I hope you remember from today, it's this framework and the importance of understanding what is actually being changed when support is provided. Understanding definitions is important, but applying them in real classroom situations is often where things become more challenging. So now let's practice identifying and thinking through different types of support and action. Let's practice applying these differences. As I read each example, take a moment to think about whether it would be considered an accommodation, a modification, or SDI. First, directions read aloud. What type of support is this? That would typically be considered an accommodation because the student is still working toward the same task or goal. Number two, reduced assignment. What type of support is this? That would more likely be considered a modification because the amount or level of work has changed. Number three, structured reading intervention. What type of support is this? That would be an example of an SDI because it involves intentional, targeted instruction designed to build a specific skill over time. This is where the distinctions start becoming more automatic and easier to recognize in real classroom situations. One important thing to remember is that good intentions do not always lead to the most appropriate instructional support. As paraeducators, our instinct is often to help quickly when we see a student struggling, frustrated, or overwhelmed. But sometimes support can become so immediate or so heavy that the student no longer has to do much of the thinking independently. For example, giving answers too quickly, completing parts of the task for the student, or removing challenging portions of the work. Over time, that level of support can unintentionally reduce opportunities for independence, problem solving, and productive struggle. The goal is not to remove all difficulty. The goal is to support students through challenging learning in a way that still allows them to think, practice, and build skills over time. At the end of the day, the type of support we provide should always connect back to the purpose of the lesson or task. Before stepping in, it's helpful to pause and ask, what is the student actually supposed to understand, practice, or demonstrate here? That question can help guide decisions about how much support to provide, whether expectations are staying the same, and whether the support is helping the student engage more independently with the task. One thing we always want to think about is whether the support we're providing is helping build independence or unintentionally creating dependence. Productive support helps students stay engaged in the thinking and learning process. That might include prompting students to explain their thinking, helping them get started, asking guiding questions, or encouraging them to use strategies they already know. Over support, on the other hand, often removes too much of the thinking from the task. That can look like giving answers too quickly, completing parts of the work for the student, simplifying tasks immediately, or stepping in before the student has had time to process or struggle productively. Sometimes adults step in so quickly and so often that students begin relying on adult support instead of building confidence and independence themselves. The goal is not to remove challenge completely. The goal is to provide enough support for students to stay engaged while still allowing them to think, practice, and problem solve independently. Now that we've looked at different types of instructional supports, let's connect this back to the paraeducator role and think about what appropriate implementation looks like in practice. When we think about the paraeducator role, the core responsibility is really centered around helping students successfully participate in classroom instruction while maintaining the teacher's intended goals and expectations. That can include reinforcing skills and strategies, helping students stay engaged, supporting organization and participation, and helping students navigate tasks, materials, and routines more independently. One thing I really want to emphasize is that paraeducators are doing far more than simply helping students finish assignments. You are helping students build skills, confidence, participation, and independence within the learning process. And sometimes that means supporting students through moments of difficulty or productive struggle instead of immediately removing the challenge altogether. These are all examples of responsibilities that appropriately fall within the paraeducator role. Things that may include implementing accommodations that are already planned, supporting specially designed instruction that has been developed by the teacher or educational team, reinforcing skills after instruction has been introduced, and following teacher guidance regarding classroom supports and expectations. For example, this might look like reading directions aloud, helping a student organize information using a graphic organizer, prompting the use of a previously taught strategy, reviewing vocabulary, or supporting guided practice after a lesson has been taught. The important distinction is that paraeducators are supporting the implementation of instruction, not independently redesigning tasks, changing goals, or lowering expectations in the moment. These are areas where things can sometimes become a little blurry, especially because paraeducators genuinely care about students and want to help them feel successful. However, independently changing assignments, lowering expectations, or creating entirely new supports without teacher direction can unintentionally change the purpose or rigor of the task. For example, deciding a student only has to complete half the assignment, skipping more challenging questions, giving answers so work gets completed more quickly, or replacing grade level work with easier material without guidance from the teacher. Again, these decisions usually come from a place of wanting to help, not from doing something intentionally wrong. But changes like these can impact the level of thinking, skill practice, or independence the student is expected to demonstrate. That's why communication and collaboration with the teacher or instructional team are so important when questions or uncertainty come up. One of the most important tools paraeducators can use is communication. Classroom situations often happen quickly, and there may be times when you are unsure how much support to provide, whether expectations should remain the same, or how to respond when a student is struggling. That's why ongoing communication with the teacher or instructional team is so important. The questions on this slide can help clarify the purpose of the task, the type of support that is appropriate, and how to respond in a way that stays aligned with the instructional plan. And honestly, asking those questions is not a weakness, it's part of a professional practice. Strong communication helps create consistency, alignment, and better support for students across the school day. This next section focuses on situations that happen every day in classrooms, moments where quick decisions often need to be made while still maintaining instructional expectations. Let's think about a common classroom situation. A student becomes overwhelmed during an assignment. Maybe they shut down, become frustrated, say the work is too hard, or stop participating altogether. In moments like this, our first instinct is often to reduce the work or make the assignment feel easier so the student feels more successful. But before changing the actual demand of the task, we first want to think about whether the student simply needs support accessing or managing the task differently. That might include breaking the assignment into smaller parts, rereading directions, providing encouragement, giving additional processing time, modeling the first step, using visuals, or helping the student organize materials and get started. These types of supports can help reduce overwhelm while still allowing the student to remain engaged in the original learning task. The goal is to provide enough support for the student to continue participating and thinking without immediately removing the challenge altogether. This slide is important because these responses are incredibly common and they usually come from a genuine desire to help students feel successful and reduce frustration. But before immediately changing the assignment or lowering the demand of the task, we first want to pause and ask ourselves, can I adjust the support before I adjust the expectation? That question can help guide more intentional decisions in the moment and keep the focus on helping students stay engaged in the learning process. Here's another very common classroom situation. A student doesn't understand the directions for an assignment or activity. In that moment, appropriate support might include rereading the directions, rephrasing or simplifying the language, modeling what to do, checking for understanding, or helping the student identify the first step. Those types of supports help clarify the task without changing what the student is being asked to do. What we want to avoid is immediately reducing the workload or replacing the assignment simply because the directions were confusing at first. Sometimes students don't need an easier activity, they simply need clearer guidance, additional processing time, or support getting started. This is really the decision rule that I hope stays with you after today. Adjust how before changing what. Before shortening assignments, lowering the level of work, or changing the task entirely, first pause and ask, can I provide support differently? Can I help the student engage with the task in another way? Can I remove the barriers without changing the overall goal? Those questions help guide more intentional decisions and keep the focus on supporting participation, independence, and meaningful learning. As we wrap up today, I want to bring us back to the biggest ideas from this session and think about how they connect to your daily practice. I'd like to close by bringing us back to our opening reflection question. Think about a time when a student was struggling academically, behaviorally, or emotionally during a task. What is the first thing you usually do? Now that we've worked through these ideas together, I encourage you to take a few moments to reflect on your own practice. Pause the video and write down one thing you may do differently moving forward when students struggle. Maybe that means pausing before reducing the task, adjusting support differently, allowing more productive struggle, or communicating more intentionally with the teacher or instructional team. The goal is not to respond perfectly in every situation. The goal is to become more thoughtful and intentional in the decisions we make while supporting students throughout the school day. When you're ready, resume the video to move into the final closing of the presentation. At the end of the day, the goal of instructional support is to help students meaningfully participate in learning without unintentionally reducing the level of thinking or engagement required by the task. As paraeducators, the support you provide plays an incredibly important role in helping students build skills, confidence, independence, and participation throughout the school day. The goal is not to remove every challenge students experience. The goal is to provide the right level of support so students can remain engaged, continue thinking, and experience success within the learning process. As you leave today, I hope you continue coming back to this one guiding question. Am I changing how the student is being supported, or am I changing what the student is being asked to do? That single question can help guide many of the instructional decisions that happen throughout the school day. It encourages us to pause, think intentionally about the purpose of the support, and consider whether we are helping students stay engaged in meaningful learning while still building independence and confidence over time. Thank you for participating in today's session. I hope you're leaving with practical strategies and ideas you can apply in your role right away. Your work makes a meaningful difference for students every day. Thank you for all that you do.